Bonjour, hello, and welcome to my channel of Mugs and Wugs, where I discuss all things linguistics. Hope you enjoy. The beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in early 2020 saw a lot of scientific vocabulary, mostly medical vocabulary, entering daily use. Amongst these, we have the acronym COVID, which is an English acronym standing for coronavirus disease. It just became the more dominant term to refer to the disease, namely in the UN and the World Health Organization. And therefore, in a lot of languages, we just borrowed this acronym wholesale into our language without translating it. So this is, for example, the case in French, where we took the acronym COVID and just used it as such. However, in French, when borrowing this acronym, we had a little bit of a problem. So in English, this is not an issue, but French is a gendered language. We have two genders, masculine and feminine, and just to make this clear right now, I'm talking exclusively about grammatical gender, not societal gender or sex. There is a link between the two, and that is a whole other topic of discussion that I will not be getting into in this video. So we had the option between le Covid, grammatically masculine, and la Covid, grammatically feminine. So what we saw in France is that just rather organically the masculine spread. So governments were referring to it as le Covid, as was the news, as were the people. In the first few months of the pandemic, everyone in my family was saying le Covid. That it just kind of happened. There's no reasoning for it. It just did. On the other hand, in Quebec, things were a bit different. So there, the Office québécois de la langue française, which is a governmental institution in charge of the French language in Quebec, decided early on that it should be feminine. And by early on, I mean the beginning of the year of 2020, as soon as it started being really talked about. And their reasoning was that in French, acronyms should take the gender of their head noun. So this is a rule in French. So for example, SNCF, which is the French rail, takes on the feminine gender, la SNCF, because its head noun is, so the S is société, which is a feminine noun meaning a company or a society. And yeah, therefore the S gives its gender to the whole acronym. Which is a sound reasoning. And since they did it very early on, the government in Quebec and the news in Quebec, and by extension the people, refer to it in the feminine. That did not happen in France. Or in continental Europe, for that matter, and not in Belgium or in Switzerland. However, in May, so a few months into the pandemic, over 4 months, the Académie Française, which is the French equivalent, decided that yes, it should be feminine, for exactly the same reasons as the Office québécois de la langue française. However, the difference, obviously, in this case is that at that point, in Europe, the masculine was associated with the word already. And because this is what grammatical gender is, it is really the behavior of a word in grammatical terms. So COVID had already integrated the French language as a masculine word at that point. So even though they had sound reasoning, there is a bit of an issue here. So first, before looking into why exactly this specifically is a controversy or could be called a controversy, let us look a bit at what the Académie Française is. So it is an institution that is composed of up to 40 members. I say up to 40 because when they die, there is a mourning period. So currently there are 35 members of the Academy, 5 pending re-election. They're elected for life, and all members are known collectively as the Immortals, the Immortels, which certainly does not lack a degree of arrogance, but that is another story. And these people can be from many places. They often have a literary background, but they don't have to. They can be from the sciences, politics, anything really. But they also, therefore, do not have to be linguists. And so the Académie Française is an institution that is in charge of guiding and deciding on rules for the French language. So if we look at its history, it was founded in 1635 by Cardinal Richelieu in large part, who was the king's prime minister. So from the get-go, it was an institution very much close to power. It was a period of increased centralization and consolidation of power under Louis XIII and then Louis XIV. And this centralization called for a need for codification and increased standardization of the written language, which is the original Académie's job. So therefore, they have three basic roles in their foundational documents. So to produce a grammar, to produce a dictionary, and to work on rhetoric and poetics. However, if we look at their track record on this, it's been somewhat ambivalent. So, firstly, their work on rhetoric and poetics never really saw fruition. Not much has been done in that area, or no major publication, to my knowledge. On the other hand, the grammar, they produced one, 3 centuries in 1932. Again, not necessarily a great track record. In fairness, they do regularly publish little articles on their website about specific grammar points, often in the category dire ou ne pas dire, to say or to not say, which is somewhat condescending, but again, whatever. It is what it is. And finally, the dictionary, so they have been producing it, and to give them credit where it is due, it is an immensely difficult task for 40 members, which is not that much, to discuss every single word of the French language and decide whether they belong in the French language or not. Now, they first produced their dictionary in 1694, so 6 years after their inception. But they had been beaten to the game by 2 other monolingual dictionaries before that. And currently, we are on the 9th edition. So it has been being written since 1992. So the current edition has been in production for over 30 years. They produce it, they release it in parts. However, the issue with this, as you can tell, is that it's a very, very, very slow process. And therefore, the earlier chapters will need updating, as there are certainly more words with A or B or C and the beginning of the alphabet that have come into use since the 90s. But the other issue with these their grammar and these dictionaries, is that they are very much symbolic and not actually practically used. The main dictionaries that French people and francophones actually use are the Larousse and the Robert. These are 2 separate companies that make their own dictionaries that are updated every year. So every year they take in new words into the French language. The Académie Française does not, obviously. And additionally, in terms of grammar, the main reference grammar on the French language, if necessary, is Le Bon Usage by Grevis. And the difference between these dictionaries and grammars and those of the Académie Française is that they are far less prescriptive. They make their decisions based a lot more on what people actually say and how they actually use the language, instead of deciding how francophones should speak their native language. So, for example, in Larousse and Robert, the word Covid is in the dictionary, but is given both the masculine and feminine genders, both are listed, and they make it pretty clear that the Académie Française recommends the feminine, but the masculine is more common. And similarly in Le Bon Usage, they actually talk about the Académie Française very briefly, in making the very, very nice claim that a lot of what the Académie Française currently does is little more than, in their words, ill-informed prescriptivism, which I honestly do agree with to quite an extent. So, in this specific case with the word Covid, the reason why it's a problem is that the Académie Française took their time, a lot of time, to make a decision on this, even though it was a word that basically defined the entirety of a few months of life. It was the only thing that people were talking about. They took their time on this, and therefore failed in their role to guide the French language, but they also, as a result, failed to describe the French language, because at that point, as I said, it had already become a masculine noun part of the French language. It was le Covid. And they just completely ignored the fact that that is how people spoke. And there's also an additional reason why it might have been masculine, and that is because in French and in other Romance languages, the masculine is perceived as being a less explicitly marked gender. it's seen as being more neutral. So this is actually the same reason why, for historical reasons, the Latin three genders, so masculine, feminine, and neuter, masculine and neuter merged together and the feminine remained distinct. And that is one of the reasons why, when, for example, talking about a group of mixed gender, in Romance languages, typically the third person masculine plural is preferred over the feminine, so il rather than elle, because il is perceived as being less gender specific than elle, in the plural, of course, not in the singular. Um, However, so when taking loanwords into Romance languages, what research has shown is that unless there's a specific reason for the feminine, so either physiology if it's talking about humans or animals, or if it's the shape of the word, sometimes that can influence gender, but otherwise, the masculine is overall preferred to the feminine just instinctively. It's just kind of what happens in our languages. And the Académie Française completely disregarded this. They pay no attention to how people speak. And again, yeah, they failed in their role to guide it because they took so long for it. And so, therefore, one should also ask, what is the role of this institution in modern French life? Because at the end of the day, if we look up the word COVID in either governmental websites or the news, we notice that only the masculine remains in use. When they have made that announcement, our governments and our news, to an extent, shifted to the feminine. But very clearly, the word COVID has remained a masculine noun for continental francophones, for European francophones. As we can see, all of this news uses it in the masculine, these government websites use it in the masculine, and people use the word in the masculine. So the Académie Française completely missed its mark here. And in general, the idea is also, why should this group, that is, by the way, extremely expensive to become a member of, it's not an easy process, and not favorable to people of lower classes, or, a lot of people just don't have access to this. Why should they decide how we should speak? What authority do they have? And why should they decide rules that go directly against the majority consensus? That is all I have the time for. It's just a very small part of a rant about the Académie Française. I hope you've enjoyed, and have a lovely day.